carries the 83-year-old man who became the second Briton to die having contracted COVID-19. The Telegraph carries reassurances from the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, that everything will be done to safeguard Britain's economy if the crisis escalates. While the Mail splashes with the Queen, insisting she won't let the virus stand in the way of carrying out her royal duties. So with me now, Sophia Gaston and Michael Heaver. Welcome to you both. We're starting with that front page of the Express that we mentioned just there. 24-hour food aid for virus hotspots.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've been looking at in terms of the coronavirus at the moment, the planning ahead, is to make sure that those areas that are hit hard have food on the shelves and also are able to deliver foods to people, particularly elderly people, of course, a particular risk of this. And I think, you're going to see it for a lot of these stories tonight. It's the government's preparation, I guess, for what could be the worst case scenario. Obviously, we've seen what's gone on in Italy, in Lombardy, where they basically put the area into complete lockdown. And of course, it's responsible for the government to make these sorts of arrangements and make sure that areas that, it sounds like some areas could well be hit a lot harder than others. So in terms of obviously supermarkets and things like that, and making sure the right resources get to the right places is going to be critically important, I think.
And we know there will be a COBRA meeting as well on Monday outlining some of these new measures.
Well, this is obviously just a huge test for our institutions, and they seem to be holding up pretty well at the moment. We've seen really exemplary, I suppose, cross-departmental working. We've seen brilliant engagement between the government and sort of the chief medical communities and the chief scientific groups and so on. So people are talking, that's a good thing. We have seen a little bit of consternation expressed, I would say, from the retail community. There's been some suggestion that perhaps the government hasn't been reaching out to them quite as much as they should be. It's very interesting here to see some of the big supermarket chiefs are speaking out and saying, we haven't been engaged. We do know that we need to understand and prepare, but we need government's help on this. So it's a test for our institutions. What's interesting about what's happening now as we move from this containment phase into delay is also it's a start of a test of our community. There are obviously going to be people who are disproportionately impacted by this. We've already seen, for example, some pretty harrowing stories about people who have autoimmune deficiency disorders and so on not being able to access hand sanitizer because there's a run on that. So I think there is a need to urge for calm as well at the moment. People are stockpiling. They're understandably anxious. But at the same time, they also have to think what is a responsible way to prepare for this kind of crisis.
Let's move on and have a look at the Observer and the headline there, virus threat, emergency law to boost NHS volunteers. And this is the move where people can, under emergency legislation as we understand it, switch careers and actually volunteer to help with the medical fight against this.
Yeah, the suggestion that people will be allowed to switch jobs and volunteer to work in the NHS or care homes. Measures also include courts being able to use telephone and video links. And of course, when it comes to sports, they're also now looking at potentially having some big events where there's no crowd. Now, quite how that can work logistically, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, if this is going to go on for months and months potentially, are we really saying that the rest of the football season, for instance, is going to have all games with no crowds there? I'm really not sure that's going to be able to take place. I mean, it'd be quite I don't think sport works like that, actually. I think it affects
we know that it doesn't, but we're in extraordinary times.
But if you look
and we've seen it in other areas that sporting fixtures have been played without a crowd to, go towards containing the virus.
Yeah, no, of course, as a one-off or as a limited time. But I'm saying if we're talking longer, I mean, is that really going to happen? I've seen LeBron James in America's spoken out against the idea that he's going to be playing loads of games in front of. I mean, it'll be interesting to see. Presumably, we want obviously football and things to continue. I'm just saying, if it's a few weeks versus if this is months on end, then I think those are two very different things, and we've got to look at actually what would happen in that situation.
I mean, it's such an extraordinary situation. It does touch every part of our economy. And I think what we're seeing now is this tension in moving from containment to delay. Part of the issue is this virus is new, it's novel, it's working in ways that we don't quite understand yet. The researchers are doing their absolute best to try and come up with a vaccine, but also just to understand the movement of this virus. It does seem to be hugely contagious. So at the moment, we're in this very strange stage where we're obviously having to pull out all the stops on kind of preventative measures to try and limit its spread. But at the same time, there is this question, will these preventative measures become too much to bear? Will they put too much of a strain on the economy?
Well, that's something that the science experts were saying, that, you know, they have to be timed critically at the right point. And if you start them too early, then they're not sustainable. So the timing is absolutely of the essence.
Yeah, I mean, I was at the football this week for the FA Cup at Stamford Bridge. So, you know, there are football games going on over this weekend. That is happening now still. Also, I think the talk of banning over 70s from attending large games, I mean, how the hell are you going to enforce that? I mean, presumably it would just be advice, but people aren't just going to say, well, if I'm 69, I'll go. If I'm 70, I'm not, I imagine. I think that's completely unenforceable.
Or if you're 69,
well, yeah.
what do you do? And you've got a birthday.
That's what I mean, yeah.
I mean, with a lot of these things, it is very difficult to police, even with self-isolation. You know, you cannot demand people to self-isolate, and you have to, for a lot of the part of it, really take it aboard that people will self-isolate because they have some sort of moral conscience.
Yeah.
Well, I think also people are sort of taking the responsible action. They're also acting out of fear. I was walking down Oxford Street today. It wasn't a sort of tumbleweed coming down the street sort of situation, but it certainly was a much more pleasant walking experience, actually. And that, though, hit home to me because I thought these retailers, I mean, there is going to be a point at which these things start to really hit home. We know that many restaurants are suffering, the tourism industry is suffering. There are people's real livelihoods at stake here.
The front of the Mail, front page of the Mail, the Queen certainly saying that the virus isn't going to stop her in her tracks and she will continue her duties.
Absolutely, and who would doubt that at all? The senior palace source quoted as saying the Queen is determined to set an example by keeping calm and carrying on, and that is something I think we are good at as a country. You know, we've got to have the stiff upper lip. We've got to obviously listen to the advice, but at the same time, and I know we're going to get onto this, but some of the hysteria we've seen from people running out and buying industrial loads of toilet roll and all this sort of stuff, I think it's way over the top. Be concerned, but listen to the advice. Don't get hysterical. Calm down, and as a country, I'm sure we'll follow the Queen's example.
Well, it's quite funny because, you know, Brits always love to say, you know, to try and invoke the Blitz spirit and say that back in the Blitz, you know, you saw the best of our humanity. You also saw some of the worst of our humanity. Looting and violence and crime was actually quite rife during the Blitz. So hopefully we've learned our lesson and can improve upon that performance.
Back to the panic buying, and it exists, it is real.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's really annoying people. In my fitness gym I was in this morning, people were saying they're really angry by the pictures that they've seen of some people just going around with trolleys full of stuff and just loading it fully up. I mean, it's completely selfish, it's totally irresponsible, it's bang out of order, and there's no need to actually be doing it. So, you know, people need to pack this in, because the more that these pictures go out, people get annoyed, it worries people, and it can quickly spiral. Just calm down. The idea that you're going out and getting, 6 months worth of toilet roll, I think is completely ridiculous. Why do you need it?
But the thing is, if there wasn't a shortage before, there certainly will be one now, because people have done exactly that.
Well,
so those people that weren't worried now will be.
I think, you know, we have to really just stop and take a breath and remind ourselves that if we don't stop this kind of stockpiling madness, that the government will be forced to ration. And I don't think that that's the sort of position that anyone wants us to come to. That's the end point that we are realistically marching towards if we keep this up. So again, it comes back to this spirit of community. We need to understand there has to be enough to go around. You may be stockpiling 40 rolls of toilet roll in your house, but you've got to think about your neighbor and the person down the road maybe who has mobility issues, who can't get out as quickly, the person who's working in insecure jobs and so on, who doesn't have the same advantages as you do. So I think we need to draw on the best of our community spirit, I think, in this.
And I suppose some of the reasons behind people wanting to stockpile is they think, well, if we do get it, or we do have to self-isolate, we do need supplies in the home. So you can sort of see some of the reasoning behind it.
But the government, a lot of these stories as well are the government making preparations. They're, speaking to the supermarkets, they're looking at areas that could potentially be more affected than others. That was in some of the other stories in terms of getting food there, getting resources there. There is no need for this completely OTT reaction. And as I said, absolutely right. People need to be considerate. They need to think about their community, their neighbours, and just act. Just be nice.
Yes. The crucial test here is, do you trust your government to be making preparations to give you the right advice? I would say that we're in an incredibly good position here in Britain. If you look across the rest of the world, there certainly are some countries where you can look to your government and think, I'm not sure, are we getting all the right information? There has become a political dimension to this. And in some countries, they are trying to sort of play down the risk and the spread of the disease because it sort of seems to be some kind of reflection of their ability to govern. I think in Britain, we're very lucky. We've got strong institutions. We've got a government that we should be able to trust. So as long as the government is providing timely information and thinking, working with supermarkets, working with business groups, working with those supply chains, I think we should all be able to trust their advice.
Yes, and we know that measures are being considered. You mentioned the supermarkets before. We know that the government are looking to allow supermarkets to stay open overnight to receive delivery. So methods are being put in to deal with this. For the moment, Sophia and Michael, thank you. We shall see you after the break. Coming up, would you be willing to pay extra tax to ensure care for the elderly? We'll discuss that in a moment. Don't go anywhere. Mentioned that before the break, we're going to take a look at the Telegraph. Having a look at this story here, the new Chancellor saying that he will not let the virus cripple the economy. What exactly is he saying?
I mean, blimey, what a baptism of fire for Rishi Sunak, who not long ago was a virtual unknown, is now the Chancellor and is now having to deal with probably one of the most difficult budgets in a long time, everything going on. His top line on coronavirus is he wants to give firms additional time to pay tax if staff are unable to work. Interestingly as well, he says on a broader level, he's looking at, he wants to lower rates of tax overall. Now, of course, there's been some on the Conservative side that have been slightly worried that is this government going to be fiscally prudent, or is it just going to spend? So to see that from the Chancellor, that's going to be his general approach in years to come is quite interesting. But of course, this is going to be a big test for Rishi Sunak very early on in his job as Chancellor. From what I've seen of him, I think he's a decent operator, but this is going to take a Chancellor who's on it, who knows what they're doing, is putting the money and the resources in the right place.
This is a huge task for the Chancellor. I mean, he already was looking at having to put together a pretty radical budget to meet the demands and aspirations of the government's levelling up agenda. That was really sort of completely throwing out the window a lot of the economic, social, political thinking of the past, looking at a completely new model about devolving wealth, increasing spending and investment, infrastructure as well up in the north, deprived regional communities and so on. So there was already this huge task at hand, which was challenging already to complete within the constraints of the sort of normal understanding of how Conservatives go about doing their budgets. We know that the previous Chancellor, Sajid Javid, was already sort of having a bit of a struggle internally there on those sorts of issues. Now Rishi Sunak also has to factor in coronavirus, which is hugely disruptive for the economy already, and it's also very difficult to know which way it's going to go. So there's going to have to be a huge amount of contingency around this budget. So it could be a sort of budget for now, not necessarily for tomorrow.
And there was some talk that we will have perhaps several other budgets as well. It won't be the one-stop occasion that it previously has been. Let's have a look also on the front page of the Telegraph at this piece talking about really a defence of Priti Patel, who's come under fire in recent days.
Yeah, so a senior civil servant spoke to the Sunday Telegraph, basically coming to her aid. This is, of course, after Sir Philip Rutnam, who was the top Home Office official, resigned. And what they're basically saying is, it's quite extraordinary actually, they're saying that Mandarins have, officials have been openly undermining Priti Patel in meetings, disagreed with what she was trying to do. And this follows on. I mean, my jaw hit the floor when I saw Joe Pike of Sky News report that civil servants have been putting out more further allegations against Priti Patel, not to journalists, but to the Labour Party directly. And then you start to wonder what is actually going on here. For civil servants to be criticising the Home Secretary and digging up mud and going straight to the Labour Party shows me there's something very... something stinks inside our civil service, frankly, for this to be going on. And you know, if you follow on from this, these claims that she's been undermined by officials, I think Priti Patel's Home Secretary is upsetting some people because of the agenda that she's delivering. Well, the fact is Boris Johnson and this government were elected to deliver, and if civil servants don't like that, then they need to accept it and move on and implement it instead of trying to undermine what the government's been put in place today.
I think we just need to take a step back and realise, I mean, these allegations are not all recent. They're not just from the last few weeks and months. These are historical allegations.
Which she has categorically denied.
It is a pattern of behaviour. And what is really extraordinary here as well is, I mean, it is deeply unusual for a senior civil servant like this to come out in such a manner. I think we need to let this investigation take its course, of course, and we need to sort of withhold our judgment until we see how it goes through. But I think there is something deeply wrong that so many people in the civil service, including such a senior figure, didn't feel that there were processes in place that could be followed behind the scenes to actually deliver justice and hold people to account. I think bullying is unacceptable in all circumstances.
But the fact they're going to the Labour Party is bang out of order, I must say.
Sophia and Michael, thank you very much. We'll have to get to the story about paying extra tax for our care in our elder years a little later on. See you then. Time now, let's take a look at Tonight by Sophia Gaston and Michael Heaver. Welcome back to you, your final outing this evening. Starting, as one would imagine, with coronavirus and looking at the Sunday Times and the preparations that the government are making. Quite startling in that the intro, in the first paragraph, they're saying that ministers preparing for a death toll as high as 100,000.
Yeah, an official quoted in the story saying that that's not a worst case scenario, it's now their central estimate. To put that into perspective, that includes those likely to die from seasonal flu, which has averaged 17,000 over the past 5 years. They're also looking at this delay phase of the government's response, which will lead to more people working from home, fewer public gatherings, things like this. But yeah, it's pretty stark stuff. It shows you, there's also talk of exam boards potentially delaying exams for students, GCSEs and so on, so some pretty major disruption there, and it shows you why this is such a big story, obviously, and why it's going to be so important the government gets a hold of this and deals with it effectively.
We know that COBRA is meeting on Monday.
Yes, indeed, and I think part of the challenge for government is they're not just looking at who's vulnerable from a health perspective, they also have to think about who's vulnerable economically. We know that people who are in insecure work, you know, the poor, people who have less flexible working arrangements, who work in specific types of industries are going to be more negatively impacted by this. There are a lot of self-employed people in Britain now. That's been one of the big economic shifts over the past decade. And those people who can't take sick leave, people who can't just sort of take a week off and spend with their family to care for loved ones and so on, those are the people who are especially vulnerable. So the government's having to think about dealing with this as a health crisis, but also as an economic crisis.
Many implications, they go on and on. We mentioned schools, childcare, people that might have to self-isolate. You know, really, if schools close, that's got such a ripple effect, isn't it?
Well, of course, if you close a school, if you close a nursery, and we do know that children are some of the most immune to this disease, which is really incredible. But of course, they can be carriers. So there is a danger there. And if you close a nursery and you close a school, you're effectively pulling those parents out of work, and that is a huge economic hit.
Let's talk about food rationing. This in the Telegraph, and something that obviously people are fearful of, and hence we've seen that the panic buying and the toilet rolls flying off the shelves, and dried foods, pasta, tin foods, all off the shelves.
Well, unfortunately, it's some of the numpties that have gone around doing this have been incredibly selfish doing so. I'm afraid it looks like they forced Tesco's hand here. They're limiting the supply amounts of baked beans, dried pasta, UHT milk, other bits and pieces. Unfortunately, you know, I don't actually think at this stage there's a reason for this other than you've seen those ridiculous scenes of people running around filling their trolleys up when actually they don't need to be doing that. And again, I advise that people don't do that. Listen to the government, of course, and be aware of what's going on. But at the moment, the scenes of those people doing that is now going to lead to rationing. It didn't have to go like this early, sadly. And unfortunately, if people are going to keep behaving like that, the supermarkets are going to have to act, aren't they?
Yes, and I mean, you have to sort of spare a thought for these supermarkets and all those involved in the food supply chain industry. They've obviously just come off the back of their no-deal Brexit preparations, and now this. So I think, we're really testing things to the limit here for the supermarkets. The question is, at what point does the government actually have to step in? And I think for everyone going out and buying 10 packets of toilet roll should probably step and pause for a second and say, do I really want to be contributing to have the government step in and be rationing our food and supplies? I mean, it's just an extraordinary situation.
But people are thinking selfishly, though, aren't they? They're just thinking, I need these supplies for my family. If I do have to be isolated in my home for any period of time, I need to have food, I need to have toilet roll, and they're going to do that. There's no way to stop them, really, is there?
We like to think that these crises bring out the best in us, but I'm afraid the sad reality is that it also brings out a lot of selfishness.
Yeah, I mean, a few people I spoke to today out and about, I mean, they were actually quite angry about this, and they're of the mindset that actually, no, I'm going to do the opposite to that. So, you do have people that are very selfish, and you have people that aren't selfish at all in this. So hopefully we'll see a bit more of that, where people actually think, come on, this is a serious crisis here. There's enough to go round as long as people aren't silly.
Well, there was enough to go around, but with people going out and panic buying, then they do actually bring the crisis upon us.
Well, if they continue panic buying and continue stocking it, it's going to get worse and worse, isn't it? If people actually get a grip, try and calm down a little bit and see, actually, this isn't a good way to behave, then maybe you won't have to have rationing come back in a wide range of products.
And of course, this is where we need the government to really be taking the lead. There is a question about whether or not we should be hearing more frequently from the government. Perhaps we could be getting, even daily or every second day sort of briefings on what's going on. I think we need to make sure that there is a really strong and trusted line from the government, which is the sort of thing that is going to calm fears. Part of people's panic comes from an information vacuum, and of course that's created without trusted messages from the government. So I think the government should be heeding this warning and stepping up their involvement.
We know one of the moves certainly they're looking at is allowing supermarkets to open sort of 24 hours through the night to receive delivery. So that's certainly being paid attention to. Staying with the government, let's have a look at the budget coming up next week. Rishi Sunak has a lot on his plate. He's had a lot to deal with in a very short space of time. Extremely new to the job.
Yeah, I mean, he's coming. It's a real baptism of fire here, because this is a very, very important time, beyond politics for the whole of the country. And, one of the measures they're looking at, he's obviously trying to reassure people, I will not let the virus cripple the economy. He's saying that the firms will be given additional time to pay tax if staff are unable to work, bits and pieces like this. But, an extraordinary, Rishi Sunak, obviously, before coronavirus, been looking to really set out the government and Boris Johnson's vision for the future of the country in terms of investment, in terms of where they really want to focus on. He does mention that overall he wants to cut tax rates. But this is obviously thrown a complete spanner in the works. And actually now, he is going to be, Chancellor, a big job in the government anyway. He's now a critical figure in our government, in our country, and we'll be relying on him and those around him to make sure that we, as a country, are ready to respond and act accordingly.
Yeah, he's got three big things now to balance. He's got this sort of Conservative reputation, hard-won reputation for fiscal responsibility and so on. That was already a challenge to marry with his new levelling up agenda. And now there's the third challenge in coronavirus, which of course is, a crisis. It needs urgent response. It's also very unclear how it's going to sort of take shape. We don't know how long it could last and how long it could be a really pressing economic issue for us. I think there's probably the sense that this is a budget for now. There may be another budget, of course, coming later in the year. We've got the spending review and so on. So I think this won't necessarily be the defining budget that a new government would like to start off afresh with. I think this will be a let's hold fire. Here's how we're prepared to deal with coronavirus. Here's some, signs of our commitment to levelling up, but there'll be more later.
I mean, I'm just glad we've actually had an election and got a government with majority, because can you imagine if this had all been going on in the middle of an election campaign or with a government that was in complete turmoil, as we saw over the past few months with Theresa May, etc. So in that respect, at least we've got a Chancellor and a Prime Minister who have a clear mandate, who will hopefully be able to act decisively, quickly, and in a way that's going to benefit everyone.
Yes, we indeed hope so. Let's have a look at a Mail, and this story, really, whether people would be able to or be prepared to pay 2.5% more on tax to look after them in their elder years. Would affect all workers aged over 40.
Well, we're really at the end of the line here on social care and aged care. Something has to be done. It's going to have to be radical. It's almost certainly going to have to be paid for by tax rises. There's not really any other way to do it. So obviously this is a story to say that the government is sort of looking to Germany, looking elsewhere in Europe for ideas, creative ideas that could hopefully alleviate the situation of people having to give up their homes, because we know that's deeply unpopular. We know it derailed Theresa May's 2017 election campaign. I think, though, that there is another interesting point that isn't being talked about here, which is a huge glaring omission, I think, if you're talking about social care. The new immigration system that was just announced recently by this government is really leaves the social care industry in crisis. It's very unclear how we're actually going to staff the social care that's needed. So it's all very well that we're going to be sort of raising the money to pay for it, but if we don't have the people here to work in the industry, then it's going to be very difficult.
And the figures suggest now that it's understaffed, that we need more people as of now, far less to, the future when fewer people will be able to come in and work in those roles.
Well, indeed.
Yeah, we need more Brits doing these sorts of jobs. We also, when you look at this story, one of the main criticisms is that this levy can rise quite quickly. So they're saying it starts at 2.5%, but where does it end? Does it go to 4.5? Does it go to 6.5? Does it just continue escalating? It's how, overall the aim here is for people not to have to sell their homes to pay for their care. But how you get there, is a Conservative government really, when people are feeling a pretty big tax burden already, going to bring in more tax? That's not going to go down particularly well with a lot of Conservative voters, so we'll see.
I mean, I suppose it rests on whether people are prepared to pay that extra, whether they think, that it's worth it.
Or if you cut something else and then bringing this in on top of that. If you cut first, then obviously the tax burden overall can go down while bringing this in. But if you keep bringing in additional taxes and payments, I don't think that's going to go down particularly well.
Well, it's been kicked down the road for a really long time. That's partly why we're in a crisis. There's an interesting point towards the end that talks about the sort of need for cross-party consensus on this, and the idea that the health secretary didn't feel that that was possible to achieve under Jeremy Corbyn, because he was very much sort of focused on being in opposition to the government. There is going to be a new leader coming into Labour. It is a big ask for a new leader of the party, for one of his first acts to be backing the governing party, but I think we might be getting to a point where we just can't let it go on for any longer.
Okay, Sophia and Michael, thank you very much. We are going to take a break, but coming up, the last official engagement for the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, Harry and Meghan's farewell tour, draws at the Mail, and they've polled Labour members, and what have they found?
So yeah, this is a YouGov poll of Labour members, not voters, members, and among the membership, some quite stark results. More than half of Brits that were polled, 53% said they were proud of the last 300 years of the nation's history. That compares to only 29% of Labour members. And when it comes to the monarchy, 63% of Brits support the institution, but 53% of Labour members want to replace it, the elected head of Senate. So it shows you once again, I think, the sort of transformation that the Labour Party's been on under the likes of Jeremy Corbyn, where they've actually moved away from mainstream public opinion on some of these issues quite a bit. This is pretty stark stuff when you're saying 63 support the monarchy versus a majority of Labour members want to abolish it. It really exposes where this Labour Party's gone.
Well, I think it's always important to remember, and this is a poll of the members, not the voters, and the members, whether it's for Labour or Conservative, always tend to be the most die-hard, and they're sort of a bit further to the fringes than the people who actually will bring them to power or vote for them. But I think it is a really worrying trend for the left, and certainly I've just come back from Washington, D.C., and there's certainly a lot of people in the Democratic Party there looking on, at what's happened to Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party here and thinking, gosh, we don't want to go down that path. The reality is that it is very difficult for a party, whether it's on the left or the right in Britain, to come to power without moving somewhere towards the centre ground. You have to straddle these voters in the middle, ordinary Britons who, care about the monarchy and have pride and patriotism. And I think it's really sad that in the left, these sort of these things have become somehow imbued in the culture wars and so on, and they're seen as kind of nasty or something inherently bad about them. I think patriotism and pride are actually incredibly important natural human emotions, and they're part of citizenship, and they're things that the left should be defending.
Yet it seems, though, that Sir Keir Starmer in the leadership race is ahead, and he would seemingly be covering that centre ground, though.
I think so. I think certainly he will be a real step change from Corbynism, and I think the most important step change will be this break from this puritanical idea of what it means to be on the left. Certainly one of the most disturbing trends under Corbynism was this idea that you could only be on the left and you could only be in the Labour Party if you subscribe to this and this and this. The party needs to reinvent itself as a broad church, otherwise it will never have a chance of governing again.
Yeah, a lot of those Labour voters that went Conservative and that took down that red wall, I mean, they'll be horrified by stuff like this. And if this is the direction that the Labour Party want to go in terms of getting rid of the monarchy, etc., I think you can expect to see a lot of those seats that went Labour, Conservative, remain Conservative, frankly.
Talking about the monarchy, let's talk about Harry and Meghan and their farewell tour. Looking gorgeous in red, actually, Meghan, there. This is in the Mail.
Well, I mean, it's almost like when you go through a terrible breakup and then you show up at the bar looking amazing. It's sort of, they've come here and they've absolutely put on their best show. And God, they look amazing. They look incredible. And I think what they're really doing here, whether it's their express intent or not, is they're reminding us of what we are going to be losing. It's a huge shame because Meghan will be speaking tomorrow on International Women's Day. We will see her at her best, her most powerful, which is to champion some of these issues that the royal family hasn't historically been so adept at wading into. We'll see Meghan sort of taking the lead, and from that position in these final few days of them being members of the royal family. And of course, Harry as well. I mean, these are two people who had really grown in the nation's affections, and I think it's an incredibly sad situation. Something that you do see at the very end of this story is a little hint that the palace seems to be leaving the door a little bit ajar. So it's not slamming the door as they go. It's saying, look, we're going to keep the situation with your titles and so on hold for 12 months just to see. And I think it's an incredibly sad situation that has come to this. And it does seem, I really do look at this and think, could there not have been a solution that
Michael,
maybe...
do you think, are you sad?
Well, no, look, I don't think they've covered themselves in glory, but if that's what they want to do, that's what they want to do. But I mean, it's interesting they said Prince Harry looked visibly moved, and the Mail saying, why are they walking away? There'll be a lot of people saying that, I think. Why has this gone on? Why has this happened? Did it really have to be this way?
I think it's just a shame. They were obviously at a very vulnerable moment, and I do think, could there not have been some sort of arrangement where they were given a break, time to step back from their duties, and then brought back in the fold?
We are where we are. This is what they've decided to do,
Yes.
and this is their farewell, and it seems to be fun. But as you say, that 12-month period being held open for them, should
They might be
wish
back.
to change their minds. Sophia and Michael, thank you very much for taking us through the papers this evening. Good to see you.
Thank you.